Hey everyone, Delph here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm starting a series of guides for various offensive stats in Dark Souls. Today we're going to talk about strength, and we'll start with the advantages and disadvantages that strength has. First thing to note about strength is that most weapons in the game have a strength requirement, so increasing strength obviously gives you access to more weapons. This means you'll rarely if ever have to waste level ups on stats you aren't making use of, and as a general rule of thumb, weapons with high strength requirements tend to have higher attack range and deal increased poise damage, as well as higher damage per attack. This is extremely good in new game, as slower weapons with high damage tend to cut through enemy defenses extremely well. Personally, if I'm leveling strength, I'm going to tend to take advantage of this and gravitate towards bigger weapons, since that is the main perk of leveling strength. Similarly, most shields also have a strength requirement. So if your main damage stat is strength, you also get access to all the game's best shields as sort of a free bonus. This is an underrated feature of strength and can make the game significantly easier in a lot of places. Great shields can easily block the overwhelming majority of enemies in the game, including some of the game's final bosses. And as a general rule of thumb, blocking is, in my opinion, the first thing you should try against the vast majority of enemies. Lastly, the strength stat has really good access to the strike damage type. This type of damage is inflicted by weapons such as clubs, hammers, and maces. Strike damage is arguably the best damage type in the whole game, as heavily armored enemies tend to be weak to it, and very few enemies are resistant to it. In particular, many bosses are quite weak to it, and no bosses, as far as I know, are resistant to it. When you take all of these advantages together, strength weapons are arguably some of the best in the game. But strength weapons do have some downsides too. For starters, many of the higher end strength weapons have extremely high stat requirements to wield. As a general rule, you only ever need to level a stat to about 40 before you stop gaining as much from leveling it. Some strength weapons have stat requirements well past 40, which means those points are somewhat wasted. Now, you can shirk those stat requirements a little bit, since wielding a weapon with two hands reduces the strength requirement, as long as you keep wielding it in two hands. But this can create issues when trying to block with a shield. Blocking here being crucial, since another downside of these strength weapons is that a lot of them have really slow swing speeds, meaning many enemies will be able to hit you before you can hit them. So blocking can be a really easy way of counteracting a slow swing speed. Another downside, which probably seems fairly obvious, is that strength weapons tend to have a higher weight, which can affect your ability to dodge or equip better armor or have higher weight shields. All things considered though, I do think strength weapons are quite strong, and that the upsides outweigh the downsides. Okay, so next I'll talk about starting classes. This doesn't really matter too much, but any class with good starting strength is a great candidate. Warrior is a really great option, although the starting weapon isn't especially good in terms of strength scaling. Bandit is also a good option. The starting weapon is decent. It's really great for breaking guards, and the class also starts with a really useful shield. The last candidate of interest would be the Cleric. The mace is one of the better strength weapons in the game, although it's more of a smaller, fast weapon, meaning it's a better weapon for New Game Plus if you're buffing it with spells or something, but it's okay. Lastly, the Deprived, who does start with a club, and while the club theoretically has great scaling, I do think it's probably inferior to the mace, so I wouldn't recommend starting as this class unless you want to. Okay, so now I'll go over some strength weapons I personally recommend, in roughly the order you can encounter them. The first one is the Zweihander, which can be found in the Skeleton Graveyard right next to Firelink Shrine. This is a big, huge sword, and although its name literally means two-hander in German, I recommend wielding it with one hand most of the time. Note that it requires 10 dexterity to wield, although it's an easy requirement to meet. The last thing to note about it is that it only has okay scaling in strength, meaning you'll want to replace it eventually, but it's still a great starting weapon. Okay, so the next weapons I have to talk about are the Black Knight weapons. These have a chance to drop off of the Black Knights, which can be found in various spots throughout the world. Some of these are extremely good weapons, and most of them have high strength requirements. I'm not going to say anything else about these weapons, since you aren't guaranteed to obtain any of them, but they are worth noting since they are exceptional weapons. As a general rule of thumb, I'm never going to talk about weapons that are rare drops though, since they're kind of not worth farming, but I think these are a good exception because they are actually pretty solid. Do keep in mind that they have a high dex requirement though, so I really kind of don't like them for that reason, but they're still good. The next weapon I'll mention is the Great Axe, which can be easily found right after the first bonfire in the depths. This weapon isn't bad, and around the time you find it, you should probably have enough strength that it will start to outdamage the Zweihander. The next weapon worth mentioning is a Great Club. This can be found at the base of Blight Town, somewhat near Quelaag's domain, guarded by two rock-throwing barbarians. This is a major candidate for the best strength weapon in the game in terms of sheer damage. It also has a weight of 11, which is quite light for such a huge strength weapon. I highly recommend this weapon. The next weapon I'll talk about is Smoug's Hammer. This is obviously a ridiculously massive weapon and is not only extremely heavy, but has the ridiculous strength requirement of 58, which is practically untenable. It's almost unusable. But with that being said, it does do good damage. Now, Smoug's Hammer is emblematic of what's fundamentally wrong with most of the endgame strength weapons, including the Demon Great Axe and the Demon Great Machete. They simply don't do enough damage to justify their weight and stat requirements. The Demon Great Axe and the Demon Great Machete don't even have strike damage type. They have regular damage type, so you're probably going to lose damage on a lot of enemies too. So my opinion is that basically most of the in-game strength weapons simply can't compete with the Great Club. Okay, so now I'll revisit the mace. It can be found near the bottom of the catacombs. Again, this weapon is too small to be a good strength weapon, sort of in my opinion, but if you buff it with spells, like I said, it can be a better weapon than the Great Club. I have used it extensively. It's not bad. Last item I'll recommend is the Tower Shield. This can be bought from the Crestfallen Merchant in Sen's Fortress. This is a great shield and it's not even ridiculously heavy. This can be used to comfortably block just about any enemy in the game. There's really no shortage of uses for this shield. I highly recommend trying it on even bosses like Manus. Absolutely great shield. Cannot recommend it enough. And if you're leveling strength, you should highly consider having a Tower Shield like this one. You barely even need to upgrade it. That's how good it is. So, cannot emphasize the Tower Shield enough. Absolutely incredible shield. Okay, so those are the strength weapons I personally recommend. As for rings, Havel's Ring and Ring of Favor and Protection are solid options as usual, since your weapons and shields can be quite heavy. Another interesting option is the Wolf Ring. This is a generally good ring, but it can be nice when your swing speed is so slow, prevent you from getting staggered on fast enemies. Like I said, these are good rings in general, but I think these rings are even better in this case, and so I think that says a lot about strength weapons, that really good rings make it better. That's a good sign. So, as for the game progression, you don't have to do anything weird. You can progress through the game as normal. You will want to make sure you go to the depths to grab the large ember and make that kind of a priority. The next major thing you want to do is get the very large ember, which can be found in the New Londo Ruins. I'd recommend killing Sif and then heading to the New Londo Ruins immediately after Anor Londo to get my weapon of choice to plus 15 as soon as possible. But you could also obtain the very large ember before Anor Londo if you wanted to, which would make Anor Londo a lot easier. As for your stat distribution, it couldn't be easier. Simply get strength to 40 and then start increasing vigor and endurance in equal amounts. You'll deal plenty of damage and be quite durable as well. Okay, so there's my strength guide for Dark Souls. Again, I think strength is a really good stat to beat the game with, especially if you're new to Dark Souls. Thanks for watching.